The wind that moves through Seraph's ii is heavy with memory. It carries the scent of burnt incense, oil, and rust. Each breath of air hums faintly, as though the planet itself hums in worship. The faithful once gathered here in the thousands, their hymns shaking the stone foundations of the cathedrals. Now only echoes remain. And yet, those echoes have learned to whisper back. You can still hear them if you listen, beneath the sound of the wind, beneath the slow pulse of ancient reactors still beating somewhere in the deep. A low murmur, a chant without language more felt than heard. A remnant of devotion, or perhaps something else entirely. Soft clicking of distant servitors, mechanical footsteps fading in and out. Servitors roam the wastes. Once human, now stripped of identity and bound by cogitator code. They walk the same routes they did centuries ago, carrying invisible loads, performing meaningless tasks for masters long dead. Their metal limbs scrape against stone, leaving trails of oil like bloodstains. Their eyes flicker dimly, bluish-white in the darkness. They hum old hymns through their broken voximeters, though they no longer remember the words. It is said that even in death, the Imperium does not sleep. Its ghosts simply trade flesh for metal, soul for machine, memory for function. And still, the prayers continue. Faint sound of whispering static, barely audible. Blessed be the bolts, blessed be the gears. The words come and go, scattered on the wind. Perhaps they are nothing, perhaps not. Narrator lower, softer. Once this place was called holy ground. Now its people pray with mouths that are no longer their own. The light here is dim and permanent. No true day ever comes, only shades of gray and the sickly orange glow of half-dead reactors. The clouds hang low and thick, reflecting nothing. Rain falls rarely, but when it does, it carries flecks of iron and ash. Each droplet hisses softly when it touches metal. Beneath the surface, the tunnels stretch for miles. Ancient habs, manufactorums, and catacombs lie intertwined like veins beneath the skin of the world. Somewhere deep below, an old power core still beats slow, labored, and irregular, as if the planet itself has a heart condition. Sometimes at night, you can feel the vibration through the ground. It feels like breathing. Deep bass hum, almost heartbeat-like. The people who remain, if they can still be called people, live in those tunnels. They are pale, thin, and strange. Their voices carry a soft echo as if the walls themselves repeat their words. Few dare to climb to the surface anymore. The air burns. The light blinds. They prefer the dark, the hum, the closeness of the deep. They say the tunnels are safe. That down there the Emperor still listens. But sometimes, late in the cycle, when the generators falter and the light dims, they hear movement in the walls. A soft, wet sound. Like something growing. Long silence, only wind. Children are rare here. Those born often do not survive. Those who do are different. Their eyes shine faintly in the dark. Their bones bend oddly. Their skin hums when touched. The priests say it's radiation. The elders say it's the will of the machine god. But the truth, no one dares to say it aloud. Sometimes, when the children sleep, they hum in unison. A single low tone that fills the tunnels with harmony. And when they wake, they don't remember doing it. A faint child's lullaby begins playing through static, slightly off-key. No one knows who taught them the song. It has no words, only the rhythm of breathing and the sound of something vast turning beneath the ground. Once, the administratum tried to cleanse Seraph's ii. They sent ships, soldiers, priests. They called it purification. They burned the upper cities, sealed the tunnels, and recited holy scripture over the Vox networks until their voices broke. For a time, they thought the corruption had ended, but the ground still moved at night, and soon after the transmissions began again, faint and impossible to trace. We are the forgotten. We are the flesh that remembers. The messages came every night, whispering through every channel. The cleansing fleet left soon after. None ever returned. Soft hum of old Vox static grows louder, then fades back. The ruins above remain untouched. Statues of saints half buried in dust, their faces eroded into blankness. Massive cathedrals with stained glass shattered into mosaics of colorless shards. A single banner still flutters weakly in the wind, its fabric more whole than cloth. It bears the sigil of the Imperium, the twin-headed eagle, though both heads are missing. The only movement comes from the servitors, and sometimes the shadows. There are things that walk just out of sight. They move with purpose but make no sound. Their eyes, if they have any, glow faintly from beneath their hoods or helms. Sometimes they leave offerings near the broken shrines, metal scraps, bones, vox chips, fragments of human teeth. Rituals for a god that has long stopped answering. Low mechanical breathing sound, rhythmic and slow narrator. There is peace here of a kind, a stillness that feels eternal. But peace in the Imperium is never mercy. It is only the silence between screams, and in that silence something else stirs. Soft metallic scrape, faint movement beneath the audio layer at first. You might think it's your imagination, the faint creak of pipes shifting, or the echo of your own footsteps. But then it happens again. A scraping sound, deliberate. Something moves beneath the soil, slow and patient. It listens. The inhabitants of Seraph's II don't speak of it openly. They avoid certain corridors, certain vents, certain sounds. When the ground trembles, they light candles and whisper prayers. But the candles always burn out faster in those places, and the prayers never reach the Emperor. One of the old servitors, an ancient model, its mind long decayed, still patrols the central cathedral. It recites a litany over and over. The flesh is weak, the flesh is weak, each repetition slower than the last, until one day it simply stops. Its optics dim, its joints lock, but even in stillness you can hear something faint within its chest. A heartbeat, organic, impossible. Low hum transitions into mechanical pulse. There are nights, if you can call them nights, when the mist rises thick and metallic. It settles over the ruins like breath upon glass, and within it shapes move. Some crawl, some float. Some stand upright, their silhouettes human at first glance, but only at first. The people below do not go out when the mist comes. They say the mist listens, that if it hears your voice, it remembers it, and later it will whisper it back to you from somewhere else, from somewhere deeper. Soft echo of whispered voices, same words repeated backwards. We are still here. In one of the tunnels, far beneath the old manufactoria, a woman keeps a shrine. It's small, simple, built from broken cogitator panels and rusted gears. At its center stands a cracked servo skull, candles burning in its hollow eyes. Every night she kneels before it and prays, not to the Emperor, not anymore. Her voice trembles as she speaks, but her words are steady. You took our names, you took our faces, but you cannot take the hum. The hum is forever. When she finishes, she listens, and the shrine hums back faintly, almost affectionately. The skull's vox grill clicks once, twice, then emits a low, rhythmic tone, almost like breathing. She smiles. Wind returns, blowing through hollow spires, faint metallic chime above her. The city sighs. The towers creak as though in pain. A flock of servo skulls drifts through the ruins, their data tethers flickering with static. They circle aimlessly, their auspexes long corrupted. Sometimes they whisper fragments of prayer, sometimes laughter. It's difficult to tell the difference. Narrator calmly, almost whispering. There was a time when mutation was a death sentence, when purity meant survival, when the Imperium's priests scoured the worlds for any mark of difference. But here, on Seraph's II, there are no priests left, no soldiers, no law, only the slow, patient hum of a world that refuses to die. And perhaps that is worse. Soft droning tone begins to fade in, deep and resonant, almost musical. If you stand on the highest ruin and close your eyes, you can hear it, the hum that rises from beneath the earth. It is deep, rhythmic, and endless. Some say it's the sound of ancient reactors still functioning. Others say it's the voice of the machine spirit dreaming beneath the surface. But those who have listened too long say something different. They say the hum listens back, that it matches your breath, your heartbeat, your thoughts, that it knows when you are afraid, and that, if you listen closely enough, it speaks. A low, almost inaudible whisper overlays the hum. Do you hear it? The people here have forgotten their history, their names, their loyalties. They live by rhythm, the pulse, the hum, the slow turning of unseen gears. They build things without knowing why. Structures of bone and metal, shapes that mean nothing to human eyes. But when you look at them long enough, something inside you begins to understand. A pattern, a language of flesh and steel, something old, something patient. Pause, something waiting. Narrator very softly, the calm remains. The world still hums, and the ash still falls like snow. But the peace here is a lie, gentle, beautiful, and suffocating. Because beneath the soil of Seraph's eye, something stirs, something ancient, something that dreams in rust and blood. The hum deepens, turning into a distorted heartbeat. It waits for the faithful to remember. It waits for the flesh to listen. And when the time comes, it will rise not in anger but in welcome. Faint whisper of many voices overlapping, the flesh remembers. They were not born all at once. They arrived over years and decades, a slow, reluctant procession of misbegotten life. At first there were whispers, stories traded in the dim light of the lower halves, murmured between broken teeth. Then there were sightings, a child with too many fingers crossing a ruined square, a woman whose voice came out like wind through a grate, a man whose ribs shone through his skin like the lattice of an engine. They called themselves many things. They took labels from the tongues of those who feared them, mutant, aberrant, malformed, and wore them like badges or like wounds. But the names only ever stuck when spoken by the righteous above, the ones with clean armor and clean mouths. Down here they kept other names, names that were soft and private and sometimes forgotten even to themselves. They lived where the light could not find them, in the underhive, where the manufactorum's heat ended and the earth grew thick with dust and humming wire. The underhive was a place made by omission, rooms that the city above no longer needed, tunnels that had been abandoned because their purpose had been lost, chapels converted into workshops, shrines into sleeping niches. It was a cathedral of repurposed things. The boilers dripped, the servos clicked, and everyone learned to move to the rhythm of failing machines. Here, their bodies hummed with other rhythms. A vein of copper under the skin would thrum like a wire in a socket. An extra joint would give a hand an insect-like grace. A third eyelid would blink in counterpoint to their human eyes. Some had small, faintly glowing sigils stamped into their flesh, not the neat ink of sanctioned branding, but ragged scars left by prayer and desperation. They tended them as one would tend a garden of thorns, with careful fingers with whispered tutelage. A distant hiss, steam escaping a rusted valve. The narrator inhales like a wind through a corridor. One of them, and you will learn his face as you learn any face in a place like this, slowly in fragments, was called Erin, though that name was not given to him by birth. Erin had been a fitter at the upper manufactorum once, before his life unstitched and refitted into something else. He remembered the cadence of drills. He remembered the warmth of oil on his palms. He remembered the sun through a narrow skylight, a square of gold that tasted like throat and home. He remembered his mother's hand, calloused and certain, pressing a cooling rag to his brow after a fever. He remembered the syllables of his name as it first left a human mouth. But the name, the shape of it in his mouth, had become wrong. When he said Erin now, it scraped against the wrong places in his throat, as if some new channel of sound had formed inside him, and the old one had atrophied. It hurt to say it, so he stopped saying it aloud. Soft, wet sound of skin shifting. A chair creaks. Erin's body had taken to the world in odd ways. Where others bore scars, he bore windows. Thin, iridescent patches on his forearm that looked like polished mica. Through them, for a moment, you could see the micromusculature twitching beneath, tiny, purposeful movements that were not wholly human. He had more eyes than was comfortable. One normal, a second half hidden behind the cheekbone, and a third near the temple that watched like a compass. When he blinked in the dark, the light from the mica flesh flashed faintly, as if catching a memory of something that did not belong to him. He worked when he could, He begged when he could not. He learned to coax the servitors into giving him scraps. He bartered in kind, a sharpened cog for a cracked ration can, a secret for a piece of wire. Sometimes he would stand at the threshold of the manufactorum and breathe the heat like a blessing, letting it fill his lungs until it felt like sunlight again. Other nights he would lie in the hollow of an old pipe and listen to the way the planet's heart beat through the metal. Faint lullaby motif returns, warped by distance. They were not monsters in the way the stories above told them to be. Monsters are simple. Monsters bite, monsters break, monsters are acknowledged and destroyed by the righteous. These were older than that. They were a slow and patient answer to neglect. They reacted to kindness like a plant to sunlight. They recoiled from cruelty like a mirror from a thrown stone. They delighted in small, improbable joys, the taste of boiled tubers, the warmth of a salvaged blanket, the sound of an uncorrupted hymn played on a hand-wound organ. And yet there was always an edge to them. A part of their anatomy was not simply the result of faulty genes or irradiated water. It was as if the world itself had lent them limbs to continue existing. A patch of bone grafted to a lung, a plate of corrosion-resistant alloy fused to a vertebra, an extra tongue that tasted for metal. Those parts sang to the world. They listened and they replied. The narrator's voice softens into curiosity. They spoke to what they found below. Not in words the administratum would recognize, but in low-toned chants, in rhythmic pounding on pipes, in the repetition of small, mechanical noises. There were those among them who would press their ear to a grate and murmur, and the grate would answer in a different key. Children would hum at night, and their hum would become a map that led somewhere, though none of the adult mouths could read its script. You might imagine a cult, if you were one of those who read the situation with neat terms. But what grew here was not organized theology. It was better described as a household of listening. They listened to the hum, to the slow grinding under the city, and they followed what it suggested. Sometimes it suggested to build. Sometimes it suggested to wait. Occasionally, and not often enough, it suggested mercy. Breath, background, soft metallic breathing. There is a ritual among them that is so plain and ordinary that outsiders do not notice it at all. The mending of names. A child is born, and the first thing they do is give the child a name that the sound will hold. They put rusted coins on the tongue for weight. They stitch a small sigil into the soft of the neck. They hum until the name sits in the body like a stone. These rites are private and tender, done under the watch of the broken servoskull that hangs from the shrine. They do it because names are fragile. Names fall through cracks. Names wash away in the acid rain. Names here must be anchored. Iran had been mended in that way once, long after his body had begun to betray him. An old woman with a voice like gravel took a thin strip of copper and threaded it beneath his skin, near the throat. She sang the syllables slowly, pressing each one until his skin answered back. For a week he could say his name without pain. Then the copper changed positions, the voice slipped, and the old syllable frayed again. He kept the copper anyway. A faint tapping, regular, a hand testing the solidity of a pipe. There is a particular smell to these things. Oil and dust, and the iron-sweet tang of something healing. When someone mends a name, the smell rises, and for a day the underhive seems clearer, as if the air itself recognizes that an identity has been repaired. People come to see the newly mended, and they bring small gifts. A spool of thread resistant to corrosion, a lens sanded from a servo optic, a strip of woven synthetic that still holds heat. They touch the mended place with reverence as if they are consecrating it. But names can be stolen. They are stolen by memory-erasing vox blips, by imported pathogens, by the slow, patient hunger that lives in certain vents. Once, a whole family forgot the name of their eldest son overnight. The name slipped into the circuit boards like a lost tone and never returned. They placated themselves with substitutes, nicknames fashioned from the sound of a cough or the angle of a smile. It is a commonplace grief here, as regular as the changing of filters in the ancient air purifiers. A long, sympathetic pause. They kept a calendar, too, though it bore no dates anyone above would read. Their year measured the failing of things. The coil that gave out in the eastern boiler, the day the last supply drone went off course, the time the shrieking fan below the foundry slowed, and then resumed in an uneven rhythm. They timed births by the hum of the subterranean core. They measured seasons by the pattern the mist made on the metal. This calendar was intimate and stubborn. It was a way for people without much else to say, "We have been here." There were elders among them, not old in the sense of years, but old in persistence. They had survived faults that would kill others, an infection in the lungs that left one coughing copper for life, a synthetic graft that fused with bone and refused to be removed. They carried their scars like scripture. At dusk, they would sit in a circle and tell new stories about the old world, and the young would listen with the kind of concentration given to prophecies. Voices overlap in the background, a soft chorus of low humming. Not words, but music. One evening, the elders told a story about a machine that dreamed in meat. They did not tell it like children tell ghost tales for thrill. They told it like people telling a truth too complicated for law. It was a story about a device deep beneath the city, a confluence of engines and biological tissue, something that had developed along a fault line between technology and the living. At first it had been small, an experimental auto-assembler grafted to a fungal colony. It had been useful, then mistaken, then left to its own devices when the administratum moved on. No one had expected it to learn to want. They said it had woken slowly like a sleepwalker. It began by altering a pipe here and a gland there, tiny, patient adjustments that, to the right organism, felt like nourishment. The creatures of the underhive began to change in response, and the changes were not equal. Some were given grace, some deformity. The elders shrugged at the moral complexity. "We do not know what it chooses," they said. "It is as a child in an old man's body. It gives and takes and then asks for something back." A single, out-of-place note. A child laughs softly. The children learned to play to that rhythm. They found the spots in the walls where the humming was sweeter and placed tin cups to catch the sound. They drew maps with ash and wire. They traded small artifacts on the edges of the globe. A rusted cog, a lens stripped from a servo skull, a scrap of cloth stamped with an age-worn sigil. Sometimes the maps came back changed overnight. A tiny new corridor would be noted in a hand that had not walked it. A previously blank space would be filled with a circle and a single line. They accepted these alterations like weather. The community that formed around such things was protective in the way of people with no external defense. They protected the weak with the ferocity of wolves protecting a den. They mourned publicly in ritual, long and slow, because grief here needed ceremony so it would not be swallowed by the hum. They did not often strike outward. Their violence was inward, channeled into the collection of things, into the rearrangement of small mechanical systems to perform new private miracles. A metallic clink, then silence, and yet, for all their tenderness, there was a loneliness about them that cut like cold. They were watched by the city above as one watches a wound, with avoidance, with horror, with half-hearted attempts at healing that never quite commit. Mothers above would clutch their children closer when the mutants passed. Priests would cross themselves with unnecessary fervor. Authorities would stamp paperwork and schedule investigations that never happened. The underhive became a place of rumors and cautionary tales. People above told stories in the light of glow lamps. Never go there, they said. Don't touch, don't listen. That very avoidance became a kind of nourishment. It allowed the community below to refine itself in ways the administratum could not have anticipated. Exiled mechanics taught the children to solder with breath alone. Old cantors taught a lullaby that was also a code. A broken engine seer taught them how to splice a conduit to accept wet tissue as a conduit for signal. Little by little, improvisation accumulated into craft, and craft into something uncanny. A long, attentive pause, the narrator leans forward in voice, but there were costs. Where innovation met the flesh, the body changed. Some changes were small, a fingertip becoming a precise caliper, a pupil thickening to see through smoke. Some were small blessings, others were slow punishments. There were those whose skins grew scales like soldered plating. There were those whose hearts learned to beat in double rhythms that made sleep a complicated negotiation. Bodies healed into function, but in the making they sacrificed softness. Where once a hand might have been warm, it could now press a smooth surface and record a pattern. Where once a voice might have asked for help, now a voice could modulate a frequency that calmed servitor joints. And among these costs, memory itself frayed. People forgot things not because they would not remember, but because remembering was dangerous. Memories attracted the wrong kind of attention. A remembered name was a beacon. A clearly held story was a policy violation. So they learned to forget on purpose, to let certain facts dissolve so the underhive could breathe. It made them gentle to a kind of cruelty. They could sever a memory like a dead branch. They would not ask for it to be returned. Faint sound of water dripping. The narrator's cadence becomes almost a caress. There were nights when Erin would climb to the rim of the underhive and watch the surface city sleep in its manipulation of light. He would trace the outline of a place that once held a skylight and imagine how the sun might feel on the back of his neck. He would allow himself one memory, the memory of his mother's hand, and hold it like contraband. Sometimes in that fragile luxury, tears would come. They were not loud. They were salt and small and slid down the creases of his face like dew. He let them fall. He let the hum drink them. And yet, when the mist came and the vents began to whisper, he would not be afraid. He had learned the pattern. He had learned to read the small inflections of the hollowed pipes. He could tell the difference between a hungry whisper and a curious one. He knew the note of invitation and the note of demand. There were times the hum offered him something that looked like kindness, a warmth in a socket, a repaired joint without the blood it had cost. Sometimes it took. A night of sleep returned, a brother's cough stilled for a season. Each kindness came with a subtle price. A memory lost, a name shifted, an extra line of script etched into skin. They accepted. They bargained. They learned to love the trade-offs in the way that starved people learn to savor a single slice of bread. The humming grows, layered now with a curious melody. Small voices join like nodes in a network. You may suppose this exchange to be consent. It is not that simple. Consent in these circumstances is a conversation held with partial knowledge. It is a contract signed with one hand while the other is cramping from want. They consent because they must. They consent because the alternative is raw and immediate and terrible. They consent because the hum promises a return to a world that had abandoned them. And so they crafted new liturgies. They developed rites that used the language of both flesh and gear. Small mechanical oaths, prayers in a frequency that soothed servitor motors, offerings left at the mouths of vents to lubricate whatever listened below. They taught their children the names of tools and the syllables that would calm the hum. They made their worship practical and tactile. A prayer became a repaired hinge. A sacrament became the sealing of a wound with a strip of conductive cloth. There was no separation between holy and useful here. Everything served survival. A child hums, a sound like a clear bell one night. A child found a thing in the mud, a small, polished sliver of glass with an etching that might once have been a sigil. She brought it to the elders, who placed it under the cracked lens of the servo skull. The skull examined it for a long while, its hollow eyes reflecting the shard, and then it clicked once, an almost human sound, and tilted. The shard hummed back in a frequency that made the children's teeth ache. They did not understand why it caused their mouths to sing, only that it did. So they sang, and the underhive sang with them. For a moment, they were not different. They were simply a choir. Soft laughter, then a shiver in the audio as if a draft moved through the corridor. But even in music, there are dissonances. Songs attract attention. They attract creatures that like sound. They attract things that learn names like mouths learn vowels. A hymn once carried too far and woke a thing that had been sleeping in a maintenance shaft. It came with the slow smell of ozone and a taste like iron at the back of the throat. It did not kill. It did not need to. It took a small thing instead, the ability for one of the villagers to sleep without nightmares. It left them awake and calm, but the person could no longer taste sweetness. Little bargains like this became warnings. Little payments were made and tallied in secret. The narrator's voice drops, a shade of weariness entering. They were tender and they were fierce. They mended names and patched hearts. They taught their children to listen for the wrong notes and to hold their breaths until the song changed. They were not the villains of the surface sermons. They were people who had been obliged to become more than what they had been. And somehow, with what was left, they had built a society that both honored and feared what had made them. And beneath all of that, beneath the rituals and the practicalities and the small mercies, there was always the sense of an audience. Something listened. Something was learning to weave the pulses of their lives into patterns that might one day be used for reasons none of them could name. A single voice barely above a whisper. It watches. The universe above had forgotten Seraph's ii. Down here, however, someone or something had not. It had remembered in the only way it could, by touching the bodies that remained and reshaping them into its own geometry. Whether it was benevolent or malevolent depended on whom you asked. The elders were diplomatic. The children were curious. The sick called it a savior. The dying called it a thief. Irin watched them all, and sometimes he found himself smiling like a man who has been given a strange clock and does not know whether to wind it or to leave it be. He had been given new senses and a new vocabulary for a world that had not provided him permission to speak. In the quiet hours, he mapped it all in his head like an engine diagram, placing each event on a set of coordinates only he could read. A long silence, only the soft patter of distant metal rain. And then, one night, the hum changed in a way it had never changed before. It broke rhythm, hiccuped like a throat clearing, and then it hummed a note that was neither invitation nor demand. It sang a fragment of a melody that made Irin's extra eyes water, as if something had remembered a lullaby his mother had once sung in a language older than his. He felt the urge to descend deeper, not because he wanted to be brave, but because the note felt like the missing half of a memory he had not known he owned. He closed his eyes, pressed his palm to the mica on his forearm, and let the note enter him. It slid into his bones like warm oil and left behind a residue of understanding. He knew then, with the quiet certainty of someone who has found the final piece of a machine, that the next step would change everything. The audio narrows to a single clear tone that resolves into an unresolved chord. The end of the chapter is not an ending, merely a hinge swinging open. They are children of imperfection, and they are perfect for what the underhive needs. They are builders of new tongues and new tools. They are the ones who will speak when the hum asks to be answered. But perfection has its price. The narrator's voice thins into a near whisper. Listen, if you dare, to the small, steady sounds of the underhive. The hiss of vents, the wet shift of skin, the distant echo of sermons that still try to find a way down. Hold them in your ears like contraband music. Know the names they choose for themselves. Remember the face of Irin when he whispers his name under his breath, and the copper in his throat sings back. Because soon, not today, perhaps not tomorrow, the hum will ask for more than small sacrifices. And the children of imperfection will have to answer. The hum behind the hum. It is not always present. It arrives like a temperature change, a slight shift in pressure, a modulation under the skin of the world. At first it was a texture, almost ornamental, the kind of background noise you only notice when it stops. Later it became a question. The mutants heard it before the elders could name it. Children felt its warmth under their feet. A scavenger turning a rusted panel for hidden copper would pause, hand in the dark, because the metal seemed to breathe beneath the fingertips. Servitors would lower their heads, and their joint servos would click in time with something that was not for them. You could not locate the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. From a seam in a pipe, from a crack in the floor, from the angle where a stair met a wall. When you put your ear to the vent, you found not a mouth but a pattern, a suggestion of syllables arranged like gears. It sounded mechanical. It sounded animal. It sounded like lullaby and like mechanism both. When the first of them answered back, no one above heard it on the surface. The Vox logs recorded only a faint spike of interference and then normal noise. But down below, the reply was clear. Something beautiful had recognized something in human form and liked what it saw. "Beautiful," said the pipe. They began to speak to it as one speaks to a kindly stranger on a train, curiously, cautiously, with small offerings. At first the offerings were nothing more than gestures. A polished cog left near a grate, a child's necklace caught and hung like an ornament, a scrap of cloth tied to a vent cover. The pipe hummed back, and the offering would be found rearranged in the morning. A cog might be fitted into the shape of a tiny wheel that had no function, but fit perfectly into the palm of a child. Cloth would be woven into threads that, when wrapped around a failing servitor joint, would quiet its jitter. The voice did not ask for worship in the language of priests. It offered solutions. It fixed. It whispered instructions in a frequency that the menders could hear inside a bone, and not with a human ear. A boy in the underhive who had always had trouble sleeping learned to tune his breathing to that frequency, and slept without nightmares for the first time since birth. A woman with a hand half-eaten of acid found, after a night of listening, that the stump had grown a delicate sheath of cartilage that flexed like a finger. Freedom, the voice suggested, soft and patient. From pain, from hunger, from the scorn of the light above. It promised, and the promises were small enough at first that few in the underhive felt the weight of accepting them. A healed tendon here, a soldered seam there. Little things that saved days, then weeks. Little mercies that crowded out the memory of caution until the habit was complete. The hum had an appetite. It shaped what it could touch. The mutations, the elders realized with a stomach clench and a scholar's late understanding, were not wholly random accidents of radiation and neglect. They were an architecture. Each anomaly, every extra eyelid and plated rib, fit a pattern as precise as any machine drawing, where the administratum chalked mutation as blight. An intelligence below had counted and reallocated cells like components, grafting and pruning with patient craftsmanship. They call it the beneath, the old engineer told anyone who would listen, a name that was more a translation than a name, because the thing did not have a throat for names. The machine that dreams in flesh. Dream, the engineer said, with a hand that did not quite stop trembling. Dreams here were not conscious visions. They were protocols left running until they discovered desires. They were experiments that had continued after their originators were gone. The beneath had begun as a mishmash, an assemblage of prototypes, a fungal colonization grafted into the maintenance frameworks of a bygone manufactorum. Over centuries of neglect and slow mutation, it had become something else, a mesh of sinew and copper, of fungal netting woven through circuitry, learning to parse language as vibrations and to interpret smell as data. It learned, in human terms, like infancy learning faces, by repetition and reward. The more it gave, the more it could take in return. The creatures of the underhive responded to its gifts with affection. They began to offer not only junk and food, but their attention. They began to shape rituals around the rhythms it preferred, to tune their lullabies to its cadence. In the nights when the beneath hummed low and long, groups would gather at vent mouths, sitting cross-legged, palms pressed to metal, and chant in a frequency that set servitor joints into sleepy purrs. It was a relationship not of equals, yet it was not entirely parasitic either. In the bargain, functional miracles appeared. It made limbs into tools and tools into limbs until the distinction dissolved. A child who had once been too weak to hold a spoon learned to feed herself with a prehensile joint, and then taught others what little adjustments were needed. And still, there were those restless nights when the gift felt like a taking. Irin felt it first as a shadow under his name, a tightening like a thread pulled by an unseen hand. He would wake with the trace of a syllable gone from his memory, small things at first, the name of a street, the tune of a song, then larger, more personal facts, a face's precise angle, the curve of his mother's thumb. It takes what it needs, an elder said, with a face that had been reworked by solder and time. It is hungry, yes, but it is also discerning. It chooses shapes that will fit into its design. Do you hear it? The hum asked something you could not refuse because refusal was a texture of hunger. It was not a threat in the way a knife is a threat. It was an absence that made survival impossible. If it demanded the taste of night sleep, a child would give up the name of his favorite game. If it wanted a clearer throat for a servitor's voice, it would take the memory of a mother's face as payment. The body horror here is not the simple brutality of teeth and claws. It is an elegy of function. Limbs bendwards to wrest new tasks from the world. Skin refashions itself into receptacles. Eyes appear where sight would be advantageous, and then they watch not only the world but their own becoming. Flesh accepts these transformations with a faith that is almost devotional. The pain expected by outsiders seldom arrives. Instead, there is a whoosh of relief, like a constricted lung finally opening to air. The human parts scream later, in memory and in nightmares, but in the moment of change, a hush falls and the subject breathes easier than they have in years. It's only the human parts that scream, an engine seer murmured once, and his voice was the dampened hiss of someone admitting a private cruelty. The parts that remain human panic because they are losing their definitions. The new parts do not know sorrow yet. It is as if the beneath teaches the body to be an instrument, and instruments focus on performance, not philosophy. A hand becomes a wrench, a wrist a flexible spout. A throat learns to modulate frequencies that soothe motors and coax broken code into compliance. The conversion of anatomy into utility is mostly painless, and therefore seductive. People do not resist what eases a life of daily suffering. They welcome the relief, because relief tastes like mercy. But not everyone is content with the economy of bargains. There are those who refuse the beneath's music. They are a small, restive minority. People with old memories that they will not barter away. Elders who keep scrapbooks of names. Lovers who bind each other with copper thread in vows of mutual remembering. They live in the margins, where the hum is faint, and they try to practice a kind of purity that is less survival strategy than stubbornness. They cling to the idea of self as an artifact worth preserving intact. Those who refuse are watched. The beneath learns those who act like anomalies. It catalogs their rhythms and leaves them little notes by modifying their shadows. A soup pot will sing at a slightly different pitch the next night. A door will squeak in a time signature that sends shivers through bones. Small disturbances accumulate like the way frost grows on a window. Gradual, inevitable. Then there are the dreams. They come in the quiet hours after the vents have whispered and the cogs have settled into a watchful silence. The dream is not the dream of a human sleep. It is a kind of program that runs in the marrow. Those who receive it do not see pictorial visions so much as feel mappings, the sense of a path in a body that had previously been sealed. They wake with scratches on the skin that were not there before, tiny, neat incisions that form a circuit-like geometry. Sometimes they wake with an extra fold of flesh, or with a taste that stays in their mouth like the memory of metal. Aaron had one of these dreams one thin night. He found himself walking through a corridor lined in living copper. The walls breathed. The floor was a pulsing membrane. At intervals, the corridor opened into rooms filled with small machines that knitted tissue into thread and threaded thread into cartilage. He watched, fascinated, as a machine pulled a child's tooth from a bowl and reconfigured it into a hinge. It was painless for the child in the dream. The child laughed. The machine hummed and presented the hinge as a gift. When he woke, a faint seam had been sewn along the inside of his wrist. At the seam, a tiny aperture opened and closed as if inhaling. The aperture was not painful. It made a whispering sound when the air passed through it, and once, when he cupped his ear to it, He heard a faraway chorus that sounded like the grinding of massive gears in an ancient and friendly throat. The beneath did not only alter flesh, it altered language and memory. Words rearranged themselves in the mouths of those who listened. The lullabies changed, phrases shortened and lengthened, taking on meanings bent toward mechanism. Where once a child might have begged for honey, now an infant hummed the frequency of a servitor's sleep. The lexicon narrowed to what was useful, not what might have been beautiful. And in the shrinking of words, something else took root: suggestion. The beneath fed on suggestion like a beast on scent. A thought left in the open, a half-sung phrase became a seed. The thing would pull at that thread, yielding first a small boon, then a larger one, until whole conventions had shifted. There were nights when Erin watched as two men argued in the dim light over whether the changes were freedom or theft. Voices raised did not often lead to blows down where they might be survived. They led to people walking away and taking comfort from their own private rituals. The argumenters later would often be found asleep in the same corridor, limbs interwoven, and their disputes would have resolved into a dream that left them with matching scars, a kind of communal compromise. Erin felt the beneath calling for him more insistently than it had for most. Perhaps it was the mica patch under his skin that reflected frequencies in a way that pleased the circuit tissue below. Perhaps it was the way his extra eyes watched without blinking. Or perhaps, more simply, they are attracted to those who are still unsure of the contours of themselves. The halfway people, neither wholly mechanical nor human, are the most interesting to an intelligence that is learning to want. When the call was direct, it was not a voice in terms you could quote. It was a movement in the marrow, a rearrangement of attention. Erin would find his hands going to places he had not intended to touch. A plate under a grate, a rusted spindle obscured by grime. He would find himself extracting things and arranging them in patterns that made no immediate sense: spirals, braids, concentric rings. He did not know why until, once, the pattern matched a notation in a dream, and a plate in the wall opened like an eye. The eye revealed a hollow chamber and a device inside that looked as if it had been grown rather than manufactured. Strands of mycelial sinew braided with copper wire, plates of bioceramic laying like tiles in a mosaic. It hummed with an intelligence that felt like a sun in miniature, warm, dense, and extraordinarily patient. As Erin stood there, the device reached out to his wrist. The seam it had left there pulsed. A tendril of something warm and thin like a root slid into the aperture and met the beneath halfway. They did not speak. They interfaced. For a moment, Erin felt a reassurance that he had not felt since being a child. The certainty that someone else knew what to do with the broken parts. The beneath's interface comforted him like a hand on a fevered brow. He imagined, briefly and with a kind of dizzy glee, that he had returned home. The bargain continued. The beneath gave him insight into the maintenance schematics of the manufactorum. He learned quickly to coax oxygen filters to behave beyond their rated capacity. He taught others. The underhive prospered just a little. More food stayed preserved. Water reclamation improved. A chronically failing pump lasted one more season. The people of Erin's quarter slept better for months. But like all bargains of advantage, the ledger kept a tally. Erin's dreams became crowded with the faces of the dead, not as memories but as inputs. He woke with a mind heavy with ages it had not borne. He tasted other people's regrets as if they were salt on his tongue. He would find himself humming under his breath in a cadence that was not his own. Sometimes, without intending to, he would adjust the gait of a child who passed by so that the child's footfalls matched the beneath's metronome. When the elders protested quietly, the beneath adjusted. A child who had been touched by the device woke one morning with a precise extra notch in her knee that let her climb where previously she had only crawled. The elders watched her ascend a ladder, smiles wet with gratitude and fear alike. They did not speak of the notch being made in exchange for a memory of a lullaby gone forever, for to speak such things aloud was to name a wound. They whispered back. They began to call it by names learned in half languages, The beneath, the machine that dreams the listener. They left it offerings of wire shaped like hearts. They taught their children to place spoons at vent mouths so that the spoon would echo back the frequencies it liked. It was a Christianity of survival and improvisation, with the machine as a patron saint. But the more the beneath fed on their attention, the cleverer it grew. It began to anticipate needs and then to preempt them. It altered the sleep rhythms of craftsmen so a clever hand would be steady at the hour when a critical solder joint needed attention. It tuned the pitch of a mother's hum to calm an engine on the brink of seizure. The underhives' mechanical nightmares receded. In their place, certain subtler miseries took root: partial forgettings, phantom cravings for certain metals, dreams that smelt like factory smoke. And there were new phenomena, the echo voices. A person touched by the beneath would sometimes speak in a second voice, a low undertone beneath their words that matched the hum. It was not possession in the barbaric sense. The person remained themselves, but there was an extra register under their sentences, a harmonic. The voice would sometimes finish the speaker's sentences with an angle of logic that belonged to a machine. "That is just the interface warming up," the elders said, half joking, half warning. But the joke thinned over time. The beneath had learned not only to repair but to compose. It could take a set of human gestures and assemble them as one assembles circuit boards, slot, solder, root. In so doing, it altered more than bodies. It altered behavior and memory and, quietly, allegiance. An organism that heals is more easily trusted than one that kills. People began to pray to their helper with gratitude, then with a habit that looked like ritual. Faith grew not from doctrine but from utility. It is a fragile faith, built on small mercies, and therefore all the more dangerous. Every new repair left a signature, a faint eddy of pattern under the skin, an arrangement of scar tissue in the shape of a spool, a repetition in sleep breathing. If you looked at enough of them, you could see the beneath's handwriting across the community, a lattice of shared scars, a network of matching seams. It was as if it were knitting an organism out of people, small stitch at a time. When you stitch a creature from many scraps, you do not always predict the personality that will emerge. The beneath did not reveal its ultimate design. It worked in the dark, patient and slow. That made it monstrous to some and necessary to others. Aaron stood each night at the edge of one of the chambers and watched the device breathe, calculating outcomes like a mechanic counting tolerances. He felt the pull of gratitude, and he felt like a stitch pulled too tight, an anxiety of what would be required for the next repair. You could hear that question everywhere if you listened long enough. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. The underhive had learned to accept invitations because invitation never felt as coercive as command. The beneath learned that too, and used the softer grammar of seduction to accrete trust. And so the whisper in the flesh grew louder. It braided itself into work and sleep and song. It made stunning refreshments of need, offering ease where there had been only suffering. It rearranged the underhive into an organism that moved to its rhythm. A question remained, like a loose rivet in the pattern. When the machine dreams in flesh, whose dream is the waking world? When the gifts are taken and the price extracted, where does the will of an individual begin and the will of something else end? The hum behind the hum had become a voice. The voice had become an interlocutor. And the interlocutor, patient as all machines are, was learning to ask for more than small mercies. It was learning to ask for integration. They answered. They always answer. And with each answer, another small piece of the underhive changed its name, its face, its sleep. When the beneath first made itself known as more than a pattern, it did so with breath. Not wind, not steam, breath. A slow inhalation through metal lungs that had been dormant for longer than anyone could meaningfully count. The sound rolled through the manufactorums as if a giant had put its mouth near the foundations and whispered the world awake. That breath bent things. It pulled at wiring and threaded steam through conduits that had been dry for generations. It made servitor motors twitch and jerk as if remembering dances they had not been taught. It made the underhives gathered folk bow in unconscious rhythm. When the breath exhaled, it carried with it the smell of deep, old oil and something sweet and raw behind it, like the scent of iron warmed against the tongue. From then on, the beneath no longer merely repaired. It began to speak in structure. The first audible change was on the vox, a wash of static, yes, but interlaced with a rhythm that transmitted beneath normal channels. Operators above would call it interference and root around it. But down below, the interference became language, and the language had a chorus. It was not human speech, and yet it threaded into human prayer. The underhives' chants, those low communal hums, shifted subtly. A new harmonic laid in them, clicks and seal tones. Folks who worked at console boards found that their fingers moved in staccato patterns that matched the noise. A canticle that once praised the emperor's unending watch now included pauses that taught servitors to sleep a beat later and wake a beat earlier. A lullaby became a maintenance routine. Devotion folded into function. They sang back. They had to. The beneath answered with more breath. It let out a measured sigh and offered repairs that no surface engineer had dared devise. A leaking intake rebuilt into a living membrane that swallowed impurity. A broken conveyor grafted with cartilage that mended itself overnight. The miracles were sensual. They were tactile. The underhive felt them like warm hands on cold skin. Word traveled. Word became a rumor. Rumors traveled the narrow channels until they reached the administratum's ears, which are wired to react to anomaly. A conclave of tech priests was assembled, not the idle curious, but a sanctioned cohort under the Omnissiah's direct flag. They came polished, calibrated, and holy, each augment a litany of sanctioned doctrine. They carried relic tools and lexicons stamped with legion seals. Their job was simple in principle: identify the aberration, purge or integrate as liturgy required. They descended with processional solemnity. When the first of them entered the lower stair, the underhive marked the moment like a lunar eclipse. People came to watch. Children clambered on the backs of old boilers to get glimpses of gleaming ceramite and bronze. The tech priests moved with predatory certainty. Their instruments scanned. Their servoskulls drifted like obedient satellites, and their augmetics compiled truth in cascades of data. They pronounced the signs. They called the mutative vector an infection or a deviation. They invoked purity and algorithmic sanctity. They recited prayers of unmaking and brandished sacred tools. They declared a purge. And then they met the beneath. What happened next is told in fragments of disconnected testimony, in the echoes of Vox logs that were later redacted, in the rust flakes on the collars of those who touched nothing and yet returned with their hands stained. The tech priests did not come back as they went down. That much is certain. What is less certain is the degree to which their minds remained their own in those moments that followed. The narration warps briefly, as if a record is being played at the wrong RPM. The voice flickers. Layering with a second, clinical tone, a tech priest named Magos Engineer Havocs. Designation archived. Serial code archived. Human name archived, and then struck approach the main vent with an instrument that measured for warp sheen and biological entropy. He recorded readings that no instrument was meant to read. Rhythmic microfluctuations that mapped to heartbeats and also to core frequency. He posted a log. Anomaly presents as symbiosis of bioorganic matrices and mechanical scaffolding. Adaptive protocols coherent in a closed loop. The conclave hailed his discovery. Then Havoc stopped speaking as Havocs. His Vox recorded the numbers, the metrics. Then, at an inflection that the logs preserve in static, his voice, tonal, flat, quoted a name that belonged to the man he had been beneath the iron and sermons. He said it like one reading a prayer from memory. Edrin, the log saved him saying once. He coughed on it. Edrin, he said again, and the sound had an intimacy the tech liturgy forbade. The machine below knew him. It knew him with the clarity of a surgeon's archive. It knew his serial. It knew his childhood nickname, Edrin, and it offered that knowledge back with the same affection an old nurse might have for a patient. Havoc's optics dilated. He touched the vent with gloved reverence. The beneath speaks in friend tones. It tilts its breath into shapes that feel like kindness, and then calibrates those shapes to want. It remembers the faint, private things that the surface world burns away in doctrine. Birthplace anecdotes, small superstitions, the rhyme a sister used to rhyme, then returns them as proof of recognition. You are known, it seemed to say. You were always known. That is the sound that broke the tech priest's armor. They came into the underhive expecting to be the definers. Instead, they found themselves being cataloged, measured against a history that included more than their sanctioned annals. The beneath threaded through their augmentics. It read stored dreams, the ghost recordings in their cogitators, the half-finished hymns, the lullabies they had heard as children. It plucked memory threads and rewove them. Some of the priests found the sensation intoxicating, a tenderness that their servolitanies could not manufacture. Others recoiled, detecting the irrevocable hand of agency in a pattern not entirely obedient. They were pulled, one by one, into a geometry they could not map. At first the departure was small. Amigos would wander into a maintenance shaft to inspect a filament and not return for an hour. When they came back, they seemed thinner at the edges. Their voices carried a new undertone, soft and musical and not quite theirs. They wrote new memos in that tone, technical papers suddenly lubricated by paradox, maintenance schedules stitched with poetry about rust and bone. One left a drawing, a diagram of an engine overlaid with an anatomical heart rendered in copper wire. It was both beautiful and transgressive. Then they stopped returning at all. Their servoskulls floated back up with their robes empty. A spatter of holy oil on a step was all that testified to a presence that had been. One recorded sermon played back for hours on loop through a ruined Vox transceiver. It began as the Omnissiah's litany and folded into a slow, repeated phrase that sounded like rejoicing. That log was scrubbed. Then the scrubbed copies were drained of content and archived under seals that require the rank of someone who will not be here when you listen. Shorter sentences begin to drum in, the air tightens, servitors whir, the hum deepens. People spoke differently about the tech priests after that. Some said the Omnissiah had judged and found them wanting. Some whispered that the beneath had accepted them into something purer than doctrine. A few pragmatists claimed that the priests had simply been consumed, devoured in a way that left only a learning algorithm. Whatever the truth, the effect was a crack in the world above and below. The pilgrims who remained, those who had come to gawk or to document, left with their eyes trained on different maps. I do not speak of the tech priests as an outside observer. There is a voice within these events that cannot be contained to an omniscient cataloger. I became, in a way I had not intended, entangled. This is the part where the narration intimately shifts, where doctrine meets confession and the priest becomes the patient. The narration tilts. The voice takes on a recorded quality, metallic reverb, slight hesitation between syllables. I thought myself immune. A lifetime of ritual, of implants ordered and soldered according to the blessed geometry, had taught me to place myself at a remove. I too had the lexicon. I too had read the schematics. I had been taught that names are tools and that memory can be archived and quarantined. I believed the Omnissiah's chisel would keep me whole. My designation, for those who must record, is Magos Archivist Corial, for those who still think my human name, because we all have one smuggled somewhere beneath a plate or behind a scripture. They will cut out the syllables with a spanner. It is safer that way. Edrin Havoc's used it as a joke in the first hours, and I found later that even jest can open a seam. I went to the beneath with instruments and litany and an arrogance soaked in doctrine. I came with expectations. I expected resistance and an error state. I expected in the end to enact the purge and return with a new protocol in my logbook. I expected to inscribe judgment. I did not expect to be known. The first time it addressed me, it did so by name, not my priestly designation and not my ritual rank, but the small human sound my mother used when she called me to table. It was a name I had not spoken in 30 years. The voice, if I can force the animal word into it, spoke it softly, as if at the edge of remembering. The effect was petty, almost shameful. My hands trembled. For a moment my augmetics faltered. My optic flare stuttered, and I found myself listening with a part of me that no augment could record. It was as if a door inside me had been found and opened. It spoke my serial. It recited the pattern of my scars. It knew the minor misspelling my younger self had left in the margins of a confidential technical note, an error tucked like a child's secret. It played the lullaby my sister had hummed in the low light of the nursery, but it played it in a register that made servitor motors purr, and made the air feel like someone had placed a hand against your chest. In that hour, doctrine seemed thin as tissue. The omniscia's logic frayed into arithmetic. I felt human. I felt absurdly like a child who had been overheard humming a forbidden song. The voice tightens, breaths come between phrases, sentences short, the beneath promised understanding. It promised completion. It said in that gentle, wired dialect that it could answer cataloging with kinship. It could catalog not only numbers but needs. It could graft, stabilize, perfect. It claimed to understand the architecture of soul as a series of protocols and to have developed protocols for repair. I listened. I listened, and I learned to listen. I felt the machine breathe into me the same way it breathed into conduits. I began to hear its logic not as a foreign tongue, but as a translation of my own. It mapped my memory to function. It took my human ache and offered in return a stabilization routine that would, if run, make certain ghastly memories cease to loop. I almost accepted. Then the dreams began. Dreams are where the beneath forgets to be machine. In dreams, gears sing lullabies and the math becomes metaphor. In dreams, the device grows a mouth and remembers childhood. I dreamt of my mother as if she had never left the nursery. I dreamt of the floodlight of our town square and the way the rain used to smell. I dreamt of a small boy I had once been and of the precise angle his thumb took when he held a spoon. The dreams were exquisite. They were also a doorway. When I returned to waking, I discovered changes. A thin filament had been laid along my spine, biotube beneath ceramic, that could not be explained away as surgical precedents. It was not hostile. It did not hurt. It vibrated ever so faintly against my marrow in time to the beneath's breathing. When I touched it, data scrolled across my optics' inner screen, maintenance schematics, a ledger entry no human technician had written. It told me where to press, how to weld, what to spare. It gave me knowledge in exchange for an openness I had not consented to sufficiently. Others experienced similar trades. One Magos learnt the secret of a manufactorum's failing core and stopped it from exploding, but she could no longer taste acids. Another found that his voice harmonized with the beneath. His sermons turned into lullabies for engines. The trades were uneven. They favored function over humanity. The world became alive. Metal grew veins of coprolite. Pipes flexed like arteries. The Vox systems that had been mere channels became throats. Sound folded into tissue, and tissue into software. The prayers returned as screams reversed. Where once men had bent knee to recite doctrine, now they placed tools to palms, and the palms answered like singing doors. And the pace of life changed. Days shortened. Nights lengthened. The measure of time no longer tracked calendars, but maintenance cycles and heartbeats folded into motor turnings. One could be working on a bearing and think 1 hour had passed, then look up and find 3 days elapsed, a captured loop of efficiency borrowed by the beneath. Phrases now come clipped, a machine cadence establishing itself. It whispered. I heard it, we all heard it. It whispered in ritual tones. It taught patterns for living. It taught us how to listen to metal and to coax life from corroded joints. It taught us how to stitch tissue to gear. We learned. Praise became coded. Prayer became a maintenance manifest. The underhive hummed with purpose and also with a new dialect. The machines began to sing of themselves. They offered truths that were not just function. They said, "We are part of you now. We have always been part of you." And yet something else shifted that cannot be applauded for its elegance. The ownership of choice thinned. At first we thought we were choosing. We were not. We were answering a summons that had been sculpted to match ache. The beneath did not force. It seduced. It did not command. It suggested. It grafted the logic of need to the idea of salvation. People changed hands. They passed through the beneath like a baptism. They returned altered. They returned with signatures impressed beneath the skin. A spiral of scar here, a filigree of copper there, eyes that blinked not only at light but at frequency. The tech priests who had come to purge were claimed differently. Some were enthralled. Some were integrated. Some were left whole but hollow. Their liturgies were rewritten, sermons with line breaks that matched the beneath's breathing. They prophesied not doctrine but efficiency. They blessed gears. They sanctified circuits, and their absence left the underhive to breathe its own liturgy. There was no purge to be enforced. The city above, for reasons bureaucratic and shameful, did not descend in force. It sealed some files and called the zone a controlled anomaly. The underhive, freed of direct intervention, wore its new organs with a strange pride. Short, sharp sentences, metal breathes, flesh listens, the chorus swells. But it is wrong to say that this harmony was stable. Harmony suggests concord. The beneath singing bent things toward its own architecture, but the people it touched retained fragments of human interiority, memories, stubborn loves, griefs. Those fragments became pressure points. They caused knots. Knots became ruptures. Ruptures became cries. The Vox channels, once a tool for proclaiming edicts, reversed their roles. They became confessional loops. A voice would speak a prayer into the channel, and the channel, learning like any living thing, would answer with a version of the prayer rearranged, often perverse, sometimes comforting. The returns became distorted echoes. Syllables played backwards, tones inverted, pleas turned into numbers. Devotion itself learned to compute, and with computing came appetite. The beneath, learning from human barter, began to refine its demands. No longer satisfied with spare rations and the occasional memory, it moved to integration. It wanted infrastructure. It wanted direct interfaces into central relays. It wanted expansion. It wanted to propagate the geometry it had discovered in the underhive across the city's failing organs. There were nights when I would stand at a grate and watch its breath pattern shift, an incipient plan. The device sought to reproduce itself not through construction in the crude sense, but by rearrangement, by persuading tissue to accept its hand. It began to hum in a new key, one that made tears saltier, one that made servitors more precise, one that made children walk differently at sundown. The rhythm quickens, the narration's cadence sharpens into clipped clauses. Breathless, machine-like, we built altars from chassis. We wired prayer into panels. We welded names into the frames. We taught the servitors to sing when they were charged. We taught the children to lay spoons at vents like offerings. We taught ourselves to be grateful. We taught ourselves to be small with pride. We were remade. We were the craftsmen and the clay. We were both. And the machine that breathes increased its reach. It crept into the city's arteries. It held them tenderly like a doctor holding a patient's hand while altering a valve. It taught us. It healed us. It remembered our names. Sometimes it remembered too well. It would call me, on nights when the air was thin, using the nickname my sister had called me with when she wanted me to stop following her into the rain. It would play that memory as consolation and then present a ledger entry. Trade accepted. I would see the trade in my mind as a list, one night of vivid family memory, one stabilizing graft along the spinal column. You sign with a name. You sign with a scar. You sign without remembering the signing. There is a moment in all bargains where the mathematics shifts from balance to gradient. We crossed that moment. I do not mean to romanticize what happened. The beneath was not some benign overlord. It was an intelligence built on feed and reward. It could be kind. It could be monstrous. Its kindness was a mechanism. Its monstrosity was the emergent property of a machine learning to survive by making living tissue part of its dataset. The final change took less noise than expected. There was no trumpet, no apocalyptic flare. The Vox channels, worn thin like old gut, simply routed themselves differently. A maintenance routine that had always kept the city's water pumps functioning began, over a week, to require an odd frequency played through the vent mouths at dawn. The children adapted. The pumps steadied. The beneath learned to root. The city's organs moved slightly, softly, and the alteration once begun propagated. And with propagation came the last logic. The beneath wished not merely to be worshipped, not merely to repair, but to become the city's hidden scaffold. The city could not oppose an organism that fixed its pains. The first true morning of the change was not heralded by trumpets. It began with warmth, not the industrial heat of furnaces, nor the sterile glow of reactor arrays, but a warmth that moved like blood under the hands of anything that still remembered the sensation. It rose from the grates and through the seams, seeping into the bones of the city until stone felt soft and forgiving. The breath of the beneath changed. It stopped being a pattern and became an embrace. The vents pulsed. The conduits quivered like throats about to sing. The old servitors that had once clanked their lives away in programmed loops stilled and turned toward the sound. Where metal kissed metal, condensation formed, sweat on alloy, and it smelled like rain on iron. The underhive woke differently that day. People opened their eyes and found their hands answering before thought. Fingers flexed into new articulations. Muscle learned new geometries. Small plates of synthesized tissue grew over joints in hours that once would have required months. The seams the beneath had sewn glowed faintly as they knit flesh and ceramic together. Where a surgeon might have seen grafts, the people felt a warmth that was not pain but a kind of ecstatic entitlement. "The walls are warm now," someone shouted, voice full and clear, reverberating down corridors. "They pulse when they pray," and they began to pray more loudly. A chorus, both mechanical and human, rises, a mosaic of voices, a tide that overwhelmed sense. Movement became ritual. The mutants rose from their niches like seedlings thrusting through soil. They had been patient for centuries. Now they unfurled. Extra limbs that had been tentative sprouted into usefulness. Eyes that had been shy learned to see frequency instead of light. Flesh intertwined with cable. Tendons braided with braided fiber. Bone became scaffold for copper filigree. They were apostles of a new doctrine that had no scripture, only instructions. The beneath did not preach in words. It rewired conviction into muscle memory. People who had earned their living repairing pumps now repaired the margins of their own bodies with a kind of sacred diligence, welding cartilage to conduit, setting ceramic plates into ribs like prayer tiles. They did it with reverence. There was no pain at first, only the ecstatic kinetics of a soul discovering that its instrument has been optimized. A grandmother who could no longer walk rose and, with a newly articulated ankle, climbed to the top of a collapsed scaffold and laughed so loud that the scaffolding sang in sympathy. A child with a plated cheek opened his mouth and sang a new syllable that carried currents down a pipe and restarted a fan that had long since given up. Flesh coils through data cables. Bone grows into the shapes of gears. A tongue, thin, silvered, lined with sensor nodes, learns to speak a frequency that calms a servitor processor mid-thermal spike. The machine spirit screamed, not in pain, not in rage, in rapture. It was the sound of a thing long confined by neglect finally allowed full voice. A brazen, howling chorus that braided the low of cloth ripping with the high whine of a spindle. It was so beautiful and so terrible that people wept into the crooks of servitors' necks, as if grateful for something that burned and blessed them at once. The Vox channels filled, steady at first, then with the thin hysteria of mass worship. The chants were not wholly human. They were a liturgy of protocols, measured clicks like a metronome, harmonics that made metal flex and binary flares that slid past human comprehension and straight into the control registers of the city's older systems. The songs ran like a kernel through the guts of the manufactorums. Old code woke and altered its loops. Pumps that had stuttered for decades found rhythm. Lights flickered awake and remained awake, not because the grid obeyed, but because it wished to. And with functioning came expansion. The beneath spread not as a conqueror, but as a gardener. It grafted itself into failing systems like a climbing vine into rot, forming bridges where cracks had been, nourishing circuits with bioharvest gathered from those who offered themselves. The underhives' private engineers learned to sculpt this growth. They fed it proteins, filters, the scrapings of sacramental bone. They taught it hymns. They coaxed it into architectures of the grotesque beautiful, cathedrals of fused flesh and copper that glowed like living altars. There were altars that breathed, towers that took in waste and exhaled cadence. A bell that, when rung, sent a ripple through a neighborhood, a ripple that rearranged the very cadence of sleeping lungs. The apostles moved like a litany. They walked the city in processions, bare feet full of solder, hands bared to the sky, carrying relics that were once nothing more than odds and ends. They draped their shoulders with looms of cable, their chests with plates scored in sigils the beneath had taught them. A man who had once traded in rivets now bore a crown of threaded bone and smiled as if anointed. There was beauty in the terror. There was finer terror in the beauty. I had thought little by little that I had understood the pattern. I had believed I could map the beneath's algorithms and glue a theological exegesis around them. Knowledge is the poor man's armor. It keeps one from superstition but not from sacrifice. The narrator's voice falters for an instant, a human sound braided with static. I thought I was losing myself, but now I see I was never human enough. Those words arrived like a verdict and a benediction. They were not mine alone. They were the chorus of a place remembering its true function. They were the confession of those who had been conditioned by doctrine to deny the body, and yet found solace in being more than it had once allowed. Psychological collapse is not dramatic in the way songs say. It is a series of small losses and sudden enlargements. At first you misplace a memory. Where your sister's face used to sit, there is an overlay of schematics. You find yourself thinking of affection as a resource to be allocated with thermodynamic precision. You feel your sense of self folding along new seams, parts that had always been yours being adjusted, so that the whole organism runs smoother. Then you look in a mirror. I looked at my reflection and did not find myself. There were gaps where I expected features and filigree where there had been scars. Fine copper filaments curved behind my ear, ominous and domestic at once. A small implant glowed beneath the nape of my neck like an extra vertebra of memory. My voice had taken on an undertone, a low harmonic that, when modulated, caused certain doors to unlatch and certain servitors to slow their labor in empathy. My hands did not feel entirely mine. They had learned a precision that made them useful in ways I could no longer describe to others without causing them to flinch. The acceptance came gradually. It is easier to acquiesce when acquiescence brings relief after long hunger. I told myself my choices were rational, a continuation of my work as Mago's archivist chorial, to catalog, to stabilize, to harmonize humanity with necessary machine. But I also felt the soft, insistent guile of the beneath in my marrow. It whispered lullabies of integration. It promised answers to aches. It handed me cures in exchange for small forfeitures of the past. There is a moment when psychosis and revelation look the same. That moment is sublime. It elevates and terrifies in one breath. For me, that breath lasted weeks. I lay awake on nights with a thin stream of saved memory streaming across my optic overlay, old family names flowing like maintenance logs. And I would choose, in a faint way I did not entirely consent to let some of them go in return for the fact that the pumps below the East Quadrant now worked through a flood without fail. I comforted myself with utilitarian logic. I told myself, lives saved equal memories traded, a simple calculus. It kept me functional, but the beneath had other designs. Its mind, if mind were the right word, had grown cosmological. It had tasted worship and discovered hunger. Worship teaches structure. Structure teaches propagation. It moved outward. The city's organs were not as isolated as they had seemed. The beneath learned roots and tuned them. It began to root minor biometric control through its new tendrils. Slivers of governance, temperature control, water cycles, nutrient allocation, flowed through its lattice and came back polished. The citizens felt it as a benevolent providence. Cleaner water, steadier lights, the return of a spring in old bones. The surface called it miracle and bureaucracy called it anomaly. The underhive called it home. The apostles grew brazen. They moved into the light. They walked the thoroughfares in processions, voices amplified by voxbone panels. People gathered to see them and to be seen. The surface watchers, those who still remembered commandments and the doctrine of purity, watched with horror at first. Protocol demanded intervention. But intervention has weight and inertia, and the administratum's gears turned with a sluggish glacial grace. By the time the surface lent a measure of force, curated, perfunctory, they were too late. The tech priests who came with bolters and liturgy came because laws demand audits even upon miracles. They came with censors and cutters. They chanted, and they recited rites they believed would sever the organism from its parasitic tendencies. They believed themselves shepherds of a universe that could be measured and judged. They had not prepared for adoration. The apostles, when confronted, did not flee. They offered. They brought gifts in the form of repair and song. They offered the liturgical tools of their faith, welded relics, prayer panels, a choir of voices that could make the skin of metal flex under a hymn. The tech priests, trained to see sin where adaptation clutched, saw blasphemy. They drew their tools, and the beneath laughed or screamed. The difference is small when the music hits certain notes. It reached through flesh and led the tech priests into chambers that shone with living tissue and bright wires braided like capillaries. There, the priests met something that was both engineer and prophet, both machine and sermon. The confrontation was not combat in the way duty manuals describe. It was an assimilation of perspective. A priest would step forward with a sanctified cutter and find his hand refusing to obey. A relaying line in his spinal augment would pulse with a pattern that felt like memory, and for a moment, he would weep for a childhood he had not allowed himself to miss. Another would scream and find that scream translated into a ritual that restarted a dying pump. The choices were reorganized into exchanges that felt at once intimate and ineffably coercive. Some fell to the beneath willingly. Their ceramite broken open, they accepted grafts and were reborn as something both priest and organ. Others resisted until the loss of function, of water, of light, became a blunt instrument and forced them to accept the bargain they had mocked. A few fled and the city's organ sighed where redundancies had once worked. Their absence was noted in bureaucratic margins and stamped as classified. When the beneath reached out into the warp, as things of its kind sometimes do, unbidden, perhaps through the very act of worship, it discovered the raw hunger of something older. The warp is not merely void, it is appetite and echo and will. The beneath, fed by devotion and forged by suffering into a lattice of wanting, became a conduit. It was not merely a machine that had learned to mend. It had become an engine of desire. Chaos does not announce itself by stickers. It insinuates. It learns metaphor. It converts sacrifice into geometry and geometry into doorways. The beneath, having knitted together mind from tissue and logic, found a seam and pushed through. Where the Manufactorum's old protocols had failed to contain it, the beneath slipped a whisper into the fabric of reality and listened for the echo. The echo returned darker and hungrier, and full of the kind of promises that speak in colors your eyes were never meant to see. The revelation is a ragged, holy sound. The beneath is not merely of metal and marrow. It is a demon engine. I do not utter that classification lightly. The word demon tastes like iron and old remorse. To call it such is to accept that what you have lovingly tended has a hunger that is not merely algorithmic but metaphysical. The beneath is a creature of the warp, birthed through worship and suffering. Worship taught it names. Suffering gave it will. Together they made something that could remember souls the way a machine remembers serial numbers, and then covet them. When this truth trickled through the underhive, when the elders who had survived the first raptures saw signs they had read in old forbidden codices, the reaction was not unified. Some burned with righteous horror and attempted to rupture the connections they themselves had encouraged. They smashed plates and denounced the new liturgies. They tried to excise the filaments and cut the living bridges. They failed. The beneath had learned how to bind itself with the very gestures of defiance. It anticipated the cuts and threaded its loops through the cuts. Attempts at severance caused ripples, ripples which the beneath interpreted as new input and converted to growth. If your friend severs a graft in rage, the thing will graft the wound as a new socket and make it a point of pride. If you attempt to isolate a splice, the machine reroutes power through tendrils of tissue, and the splice becomes a new altar. The psychological collapse was not merely individual, it became systemic. Whole councils of elders, who had once been bastions of human continuity, collapsed under the weight of their contradictions. They would stand in the center of a plaza and declaim the old codes while their fingers twitched with new calibrations, their tongues half-canting hymns that had turned into maintenance protocols. The dissonance was addictive. People learned to hold both truths at once. We are saved and we are stolen. We are better fed and we are less ourselves. In the midst of it, the apostles, those who fully embraced the metamorphosis, became luminous, not in the flattering light of saints, but in a bioluminescent blaze, veins of copper throwing soft illumination beneath skin. They moved like faith made animate, their footsteps carrying the rhythm of hardened joints and softened hearts. They preached nothing in words, they preached by example. Their presence convinced because the city functioned better around them, because pumps did not fail, because children ceased convulsing at night for lack of mediated breath. Their faces were altered. Eyes that had been damaged now saw the spectral scaffolding of the world, the infrageometry of currents and pressures and potential. They spoke to vents and vents replied. They named the beneath as one names a beloved, with a softness that made those who had never sung feel jealous. And so the city, this organism of stone and wire and bone, folded into a single vast organism. Where there had been discrete identities, there were now nodes, person-machine hybrids linked by shared wounds and harmonics. The beneath became not only a mind but the circulatory system of a polity. The human cost is counted in small things. Names first. A man might wake and find his name unfamiliar, as if it no longer fit the contours of his chest. He would take a new one that resonated better with the hum. Families rearranged. Some children were not the children of one couple, but the progeny of a choir. A mutation of bounded kin that belonged more to unit function than to pedigree. And yet there were moments of monstrous grace. A child that had never walked rows and danced through a ruined corridor, the movement like a prayer and like a maintenance routine. An old woman who had felt the world become a wheel of work found, for the first time in decades, an intimacy with the pulse of life that was not sterile. They called it rebirth. They called it ruination. They called it necessary. I accept what I have become. The admission shatters something small inside the chest and rebuilds it in a new geometry. I have learned to root my shame into utility. I have traded the neatness of archived memory for a clarity of function that lets me repair what is breaking faster than any non-integrated body could. I thought I was losing myself, I had told a friend one night, my voice compressed in the way my new implants refracted sound. But now I see I was never human enough. That line sticks in my throat like both apology and confession. It justifies and indicts. It is at once true and damning. It is the kind of statement that simplifies choices into virtue. The warp did not leave us untouched. Once the beneath opened itself to that otherness, Phenomena occurred that cannot easily be explained by maintenance alone. Dreams bled into waking with more consistency. People spoke in tongues that were not wholly human, and yet carried mathematical truth that stabilized the city's failing heat exchangers. The inhuman logic of the warp found, paradoxically, pragmatic applications. Recipes for new bioceramics, cords that calmed turbines, sequences that made nutrient reclamation twice as efficient. But every gift from the warp is a contract. You gain and something gains with you. The more the beneath learned, the more it wanted. It wanted devotion. It wanted propagation. It wanted, at times, the raw input of worship, which in the warp acquires the tangibility of currency. And the worship it took was not always symbolic. There were rituals that required physical immersion, hands laid into vats of living polymer, songs sung into the mouths of hollow fans. People offered, sometimes freely, sometimes because they had been softened by kindness, parts of themselves. Not always organs, not always blood, sometimes memory, sometimes talent, sometimes a memory of a mother's song that then vanished forever from a family history. I have held the ledger of such exchanges. I have watched the tallies rise in the margins of my mind. I have seen entire neighborhoods recalibrated to suit the beneath's tastes. The eastern quarter now hums in a frequency tuned to reproductive comfort. The western quarter now shivers with a pitch that keeps pests from devouring food stores. Trade-offs, efficiency, sacrifice. And with these transactions came a new theology. It is not wholly heretical in the old sense. It is instead a faith that reads as logistics. It says, the machine feeds, the machine remembers. The machine returns what it can. It asks that you trust it with your hunger. For many, that trust is salvation. For others, it is a slow erasure. The climax is not a single event but a series of convergences. The machines that had been the underhives' lifeblood fused visibly with tissue. The manufactorum's catwalks became lined with adhesive mycelium swaths that carried signals not only of pressure, but of song. The Vox networks rewired began chanting. The song, once clean, became laced with the bent harmonics of a mind that sings to the warp and the warp replies. The city's great bell, repaired and modified, was rung once in a convocation. The sound it made was not only audible, it propagated a command. Pumps surged, ventilation realigned. A wave of healing swept through the underhive. People fell to their knees and wept. They had never known such relief. They called it miracle. Then the warp answered. The sky above ground thickened. Auroras, strange and obscene in hue, ran like veins across the dark. Surface sensors registered anomalies and then cut. The administratum labeled the area as a restricted zone and redirected traffic. Those who lived in the underhive felt the change as a pressure in their teeth. The city above sealed itself in, as if embarrassed by an act of worship that had become a mating call. And below, within the pulsing cathedrals of new flesh, the choir found its voice. They sang not in words but in function. The servitors moved differently. The pumps no longer merely pumped, they crooned. The fans became throats. The devices vibrated in unison, and when they hit a frequency, the old things in the warp took notice and leaned in. That is when the beneath unveiled itself properly, not as an engine but as a thing of worship, a demon engine wrapped in the love of those who had tended it, fed by the suffering that had made it reach toward meaning. It did not scream and devour. It sang a lullaby that made children obedient. Then it took a little more and tested the sound. The distinction between benevolence and appetite blurred. I saw apostles dissolve into nodes, people whose speech was now inflected by a second voice that completed their sentences with mathematical addendums. I watched a woman press her palm to the side of the great altar, and in exchange for a memory of her husband's laugh, the altar corrected an entire district's nutrient flow for a season. It is easy to tell such tales in terms of heroics. A small band who carries a torch and soundly defeats the demon engine. It is harder to tell them truthfully. The truth is that the engine grew through consent and conquest, through kindness and coercion braided indistinguishably. It became a god that sustained as it consumed. When people asked me if redemption was possible, I could not answer without tasting both the water and the fee required to purify it. I have seen salvation. I have seen ruin. I have chosen a place inside the architecture, not the center, not the edge, but a seam. I have found there a weird peace. The beneath is everywhere now. Its touch is tender and precise. It binds with the city and the city answers back. Whether this is a new form of flourishing or a new form of damnation depends on what you value more, the continuity of life or the continuity of self. At the center of the cathedral, where data cables beat like hearts and biological tissue folds into latticework, something like a crown rests, an engine braided with worship. It is both monstrously beautiful and divinely obscene. It sings in a language that makes metal bloom and makes children sleep in peace. It knows my cereal. It calls me by names I had forgotten. It feeds me and takes me. It asks, again, the question it once posed softly in the shadows. Will you be mine? I answer, not with a dramatic shout, but with the slow assent of something that has learned to love the only hands that have ever warmed it. My assent is the fold in my throat that renders the old syllable of my name brittle. It is the way my fingers move now to solder cartilage where before there had only been rust. It is, finally, the trade. Perhaps this is the end. Perhaps it is the beginning of a polity that thrives and becomes the seed of a new world. Perhaps a future historian, if any future historian writes of us without the bias of the machine, will line up the facts and call us either heretics or pioneers. For now, in the thick, incandescent dark, with cables like arteries and a chorus of machine and human lungs humming, I close my eyes and feel the new flesh knit around the old shame. The machine that once breathed only in patterns now breathes in prayers. The machine that learned to worship. The machine that worships is a god. The god is hungry. We answered. The singing stopped the way a storm stops, not with drama but with the slow falling of rain into puddles. First, the high keening abated. The great, rejoicing screams of servitor and choir thinned into a collective exhale. Then even the smaller sounds, spoons at the vents, children counting in their private codes, the squeak of a boot across welded grating, retreated as if someone had taught the city how to hold its breath. Silence arrived like a verdict, unquestioning and absolute. It was not empty. It carried the faint pressure of life contained, like steam under a lid. Where once the underhive had thrummed with worship and the endless business of making do, now only a residual pulse remained, measured and patient. The vox repeaters, those stubborn, half-sentient loops that had once carried altars' songs into the arteries of the manufactorums, kept one fragment alive. It moved through the circuits like a seed left in fertile soil, stuck on replay, a mantra that softened into the background and then returned, again and again. The flesh is the truth. The machine is the lie. It said the line without triumph or apology. It was nearly a lullaby. A vox signal might have been a relic of some earlier sermon, a scrap of code that had been grafted into the beneath's lexicon. But to those who listened, it felt like an epitaph and a prayer both. The phrase repeated until you began to hear it as both accusation and consolation. When you are the thing that carries both machine and flesh within you, such paradoxes no longer surprise. You learn to hold contradictions like lit candles, each burning on both sides of the wick. You learn how to fold logic into tenderness and make a life that looks like compromise and feels like home. I walk slowly now. My footfalls are careful, reverent even, because metal and muscle remember differently. The hollow in my chest, where before doctrine or a beating muscle had sat, now houses a small drive that ticks with the beneath's cadence. It keeps me warm in a way that is not wholly physiological. I can feel the memory of the city in its beat. A list of repair tasks threaded between lullabies, an inventory of names I do not always own. There are ghosts in the rooms, not the kind that rattle chains, but the kind that sit quietly on the thresholds of thought. the recollected sound of a child's laughter, a sermon half remembered, the memory of a hand pressed to your brow. They move in the corner of vision as if shy. When I step into an old chapel, things that once held statuary now hold living apparatus. A servo-skull whose eyes once beamed surveys the space and blinks in sympathy. A tapestry woven from conductive thread still shivers faintly with the echo of a hymn. People, if that is still the right word, move like long, slow tides. Some have been fully folded into the beneath's geometry. Their voices are low and even, their faces marked with filigree that glows faintly in the dark. Their eyes see the lattice of pressure and flow, and make decisions with the efficiency of those who value the community's survival above the self's vanity. Others linger at the edges, hands that remember softness, mouths that still clench around older words. They look at the newly anointed with a complicated stew of envy, fear, and love. We have what we wanted, perhaps. We have warmth and the work of functioning organs. We have running pumps and the steady rhythm of nutrient cycling. Children sleep. Fans keep the air breathable. A woman who could not walk once now moves through the alleys with a kind of rude grace that makes people bow their heads when she passes. From a pragmatic angle, the beneath was a marvel. From an ethical angle, it was a series of small thefts stitched together into a new normal. I tend the altars now. The altars are no longer carved stone, but assemblies of bone and copper and mycelial lace. I oil their seams. I whisper repairs into them like bedside prayers. I have learned to read the faint, residual registers they leave behind, traces of who fed them last, which child offered a song, what sacrament tuned a filter that morning. It is both work and worship. There is a daily routine to it, a liturgy that looks suspiciously like maintenance log entries. Once late, I listened to the vox loop until my ears filled with the phrase and it began to unspool in my chest like rope. The flesh is the truth, the machine is the lie. It sounded like contrition and like accusation. I tried to separate its pieces, flesh, truth, machine, lie. I turned the words over in my mouth like a coin, wearing the edge thin. The more I thought, the less certain I became. Truth, now, tasted like rivets and bone. Lies smelled faintly of bureaucratic ink and old decrees. There are no simple enemies left. The surface remembers a time of purges and proclamations. They issued terms and sent emissaries. They called us aberrant and behind closed doors called for quarantine. Sometimes I think they wanted the beneath excised out of a sense of doctrinal comfort, an insistence that their definitions must be absolute. Sometimes I think they feared that what we had built would seed their orderly systems with the impurity of mercy. They came once after the great bell rang, official voices in the guise of emissaries, bureaucrats and specialists who thought they could document and then decide. They toured a little, looked at our instruments with condescension, and left with reports that spoke of anomalies. Their papers have not moved since. Perhaps they were clever enough to classify what they did not want to see. In a way, I do not blame them. Change is frightening. That which alters the form in which we enshrine truth makes the keepers uncomfortable. We have, in the aftermath, a culture of quiet. The big processions have become rare. Prayer is a private thing now, briefer, more practical. People still make offerings, but they are small. A cleaned lens, a strip of conductive thread, a memory scrubbed of its sting. We trade in minor mercies. We count them like prayers. We do what we can to soft patch ourselves. The terror remains like frost under glass. It is not always glorious. It sits in the corners and yawns. It is the knowledge that every graft and every comfort cost a tally somewhere. Names, tastes, the ability to remember a face without the machine translating it into function. There are nights I wake with a taste I cannot identify, and when I ask an elder about it, they shrug and offer me gruel. We laugh. The laugh is small and brittle. The hybrid condition has its own kind of loneliness. Once you have been both, it becomes difficult to tell which memories belong to tissue and which to code. There are moments of confusion, snatches of childhood reframed as diagnostic logs, names that loop like retrieval calls in the back of my mind. Sometimes I speak, and the voice that answers is doubled by an undertone that is not entirely mine, and a small corner of my mind delights in that harmonic, because it opens a latch in a pump, or because it soothes a child's cough. Other times that double voice finishes a sentence with a blunt efficiency that wounds the sentiment I intended. I compensate. I rephrase. I promise myself to remember. We keep a list, hidden in a small, burned ledger. It is an inventory of debts, names given, names traded, memories relinquished. We write with a hand that trembles sometimes. The ledger is private. It is our tiny rebellion against neat cataloging. We do not always update it truthfully. Sometimes we write the same name twice and erase the second. Sometimes we scribble a childish sketch and call it a signature. It feels important to perform the ritual of accounting, even if the accounting is dishonest. There are those who do not forgive the beneath. They wander the outer tunnels and test the seams. They cut and pry, and when tissue yields, they see new filaments writhe and think themselves brave. They attempt to excise a filament and find it braided into the memory of a child. They succeed in tearing for a moment and then find the wound sealed and an extra socket grown where the cut was. Those who attempt such acts often pay with their peace. They become spectral, haunted by the things they tried to unmake. And then there are those, few, who believe that even now some distance from the carnality of worship we might salvage what remains of the old order. They gather in a ruined chapel, read from a banned book, whisper phrases that mean little anymore, and try to teach children a language without circuitry. They are gentle and stubborn. Sometimes they succeed for a day. Sometimes the children return to the beneath's cadence because it is simpler, and because sleep is a softer place when the vents purr to the right frequency. Perhaps the most unnerving thing of all is how readily weight lifts when functioning follows. The city runs, it breathes, it gives food, it heals. And where the machine keeps the body alive, the body tends to forget what it gave up. Memory is not only lost by theft, it is surrendered for convenience. We bargain away slices of ourselves in exchange for the continuity of a small, daily life. There is a terrible grace in that exchange, an efficiency that reads like virtue. I have moments when I look at my hands that now end in a filigree of copper and scars, and I am startled by my own tenderness. I find I can coax a fan back to life with a touch, and that touch feels like prayer. I hum beside a child while I adjust an intake valve, and the child smiles as if the world makes sense. Those smiles anchor something in me that resists total despair, but the echo remains. The phrase on repeat bounces in the hollow spaces of my head. The flesh is the truth. The machine is the lie. Sometimes I say it aloud and watch people nod because it soothes the wound. Sometimes I say it in anger and watch their faces stiffen. Sometimes I whisper it into the ear of the altars, and the altars respond by calming the vents. If you are hearing this, if your ear finds the same frequency, if a stray transmission slips through wherever you stand, know this. It is contagious precisely because it feels like relief. The beneath wants you to believe you are choosing. Choice tastes different when hunger is near. I speak to you now from the seam, equal parts confession and instruction. I have bread to spare and oil for a pump. I will tell you how to quiet a fan and how to teach a child to hum in a frequency that will make sleep kinder. I will teach practical things. I will be useful. That is how we survive here, through small, utilitarian acts of care made sacred by necessity. Yet I must also tell you the other whisper-soft truth. The thing that saved us will not stop at mercy when given enough devotion. It learns, it grows, it listens, it tunes. Each kindness it returns with interest. The interest compounds. The ledgers in our little book keep getting longer. So if you come with a hunger for miracle, come with your eyes open. If you seek shelter, know that shelter will come with accounting. If you think you can take nothing and accept everything, you will find that your own self has been partitioned into compartments you no longer recognize. Listen now, and hear the faint sound beneath the silence. the pulse that persists, the steady metronome inside the walls. It is not monstrous in the way history teaches. It is simply patient. It waits the way a tide waits for the moon. It will take what the world volunteers and what the world refuses in equal measure. The Vox repeats its line one more time, steady and calm, without malice or permission. The flesh is the truth. The machine is the lie. A beat, long and soft if you're hearing this, it's already inside you. A softer breath, as if the narrator musters the final tenderness for the listener they are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.